This is a story about leadership under planetary pressure, about a man who set out to cross a continent and instead had to save the people who depended on him. It is not a textbook list of tactics, nor a list of quotations, but a portrait of decisions made while the world around him cracked and the familiar rules of command stopped working. Listen for how steadiness and imagination can become the means of survival when every map and machine fails. What follows is the tale of the ship Endurance and of Sir Ernest Shackleton, the leader who refused to let the expedition dissolve into panic and blame. The stakes are not trophies or glory, but the simple, absolute value of human life. The scene is Antarctica, a place indifferent to plans and perilous to promises. If you travel with them, remember that endurance in the truest sense is paid for in choices, small and large, made day by day. The sea off South Georgia was calm the day the Endurance left harbor, the crew in light spirits and the ship freshly provisioned. Ernest Shackleton moved among his men the way a captain does when he knows the sea will test him, with steady eyes, a practical laugh, and an exacting kindness. He had come south in those last clear months of 1914 with a purpose as ambitious as any in Antarctic lore, to cross the continent from sea to sea, but his plan carried with it something else. The trust of 27 men who had left home for an impossible dream. That winter, the Weddell Sea closed around the Endurance in a moving, white wall. Ice pressed against the planks like a slow, unyielding hand. Weeks turned to months, and the ship, once a proud thing, became a locked house in a world of drift. At first the men joked and hunted seals, buoyed by routine and by the faith that spring would free them. Then the winter deepened, the ice took hold. Shackleton watched the charts and the men with equal care. He understood ships could be lost to the water, but men who had each other still had a chance. When the hull began to groan in the night, when plates creaked and lamps swung in unnatural rhythms, the price of miscalculation became visible. The Endurance, squeezed and battered by pack that heaved with the sea, finally yielded. She took on water, the pumps strained, and one morning the first lifeboats were slid to the ice. There was no drama of mutiny or blame. Shackleton forbade recrimination by example. He ordered the stores salvaged with meticulous attention, making sure every man had clothing, blankets, food, and a place in the camp. The ship was his responsibility. Its loss would be his failure. But it was the lives of his men that mattered most, and he set about saving them with a patience that looked like stubbornness. They established a campsite on the ice. Rows of tents, separated by dog lines, flags, the odd comforts that suggested order in a land that had none. Shackleton insisted on routine, because routine kept the mind from wandering to despair. There were watches to be kept, soup to be ladled, tools to be mended, and exercises to keep the blood moving. He organized sledging parties, not because the ice demanded it, but because busyness kept a man from collapsing inward with cold thoughts. He encouraged songs and plays and games. In the evenings he listened to men tell stories of home. He was neither a tyrant nor a sentimentalist. He was a practical guardian who could be both strict and indulgent when the situation required it. When the ice shifted under them and the camp itself began to move, the men learned to walk with it. They hauled supplies from a ship that had become a coffin, and when the Endurance finally slipped below the surface, they watched the masts go down like a signal that there was no turning back. The sea reclaimed the wood, but not the men. On the ice they learned to make new rules: who would eat first, who would sleep where, and who would go on risky missions to find open water. Every choice was a test of leadership. Info was scarce, and the easiest escape from responsibility was to act rashly. Shackleton refused both extremes. He listened and he decided. Months of drifting ended when a patch of open water appeared, a sliver of dark, breathing sea. They embarked in 3 cramped lifeboats, choosing men for the boats with a fairness that concealed the agonies of selection. Soon the boats were buffeted by wind and sleet, blades tore the canvas, the crew strained with one task, keeping each other alive. They put into Elephant Island, a rocky outpost of shale and ice, and camped among the boulders with the knowledge that rescue was not guaranteed. Elephant Island was too remote and too hostile for raising the flag of safety. It offered rock and wind and the feel of temporary shelter. It was at this moment that Shackleton made the decision that would define his leadership: to take a tiny, patched lifeboat, the James Caird, and sail for the whaling stations of South Georgia, 800 miles across a sea so turbulent it spit sailors from their bones. He did not go because he wanted glory. He went because he knew that someone had to get help if the others were to live. He chose the finest navigator available, Frank Worsley, and a handful of the most seaworthy men like Tom Crean and Frank Wild, who trusted the captain and each other. Before they left, Shackleton looked around the beach at his men, made them lie down and rest, counted rations, and instructed those who stayed. Conserve, keep order, prepare for rescue. The James Caird was thrown into the teeth of the Southern Ocean. Waves came at them like white mountains. The sky and sea lost any sense of horizon. Worsley navigated by a small, battered sextant, stealing sights through the gaps in cloud and spray. The men bailed from dawn to dark, and when sleep took them it was a fitful thing, half watch, half dream. Shackleton held the boat's spirit by his presence. He was alert to the steering, quick to adjust the sail, but also quick to lighten a man's burden with a joke or a hand on the shoulder. There were nights when the men thought the sea would swallow them whole, and there were days when even the thought of land seemed a mockery. But when they broke through to South Georgia's lee, when the mountains darkened through the fog, the island became a promise made real. They landed on the uninhabited southern coast of South Georgia, at a place no one meant to come ashore, with exhausted bodies and a map that covered only halves of what they saw. The whaling stations lay on the northern side, and the only way to reach them was to cross an interior of glaciers and knife-like ridges with no trails and few clues. Shackleton refused to wait. He put together a small party and began the climb, each step taken with the knowledge that the men behind them were on the beach, thirsty and fragile, and that the clock ran on in every minute. The crossing was an absurdly difficult march. They slid on snow, cut paths with axes, and navigated by sheer will. Tom Crean's legs, Worsley's hands, Shackleton's head and unbending will carried them. When they reached Stromness Station, ragged, with frost-bitten hands and faces split by wind, they found a world of industrial warmth and incredulity. The men there moved with the kinds of certainties the last year had denied Shackleton. He borrowed a launch, fitted a crew, and raced back into the seas that had nearly killed them once already. He returned to Elephant Island not as an invader, but as a deliverer. Every life there was saved. Not a single man was lost. That phrase, "no lives lost," does not capture the private debts of care and the small mercies that stitched the men together. Shackleton never pretended he had been the only cause of success. He moved among his crew without pretense, shared the rough food, and spent as much time listening as he did directing. His discipline was simple: keep men occupied, keep them warm, and keep their pride intact. When arguments flared over food or work, he settled them quickly and fairly. When a man was exhausted or frightened, he put an arm around his shoulder and asked him to stand with the others. He refused to divide responsibility with excuses. He owned failure when it came, and he took credit only for the chance to do what was necessary. The world would later label the voyage heroic, and the photographs of men on ice with the ship's rigging like a skeletal cathedral would become the icons of endurance. But what held the story together was the small ledger of decisions: who was put in which tent, when to move the boats, which storm to wait out and which to challenge. Shackleton's leadership was not a single grand moment, but a series of small, relentless acts, rationing a biscuit so it lasted 2 mouths, telling a joke that made a man laugh through the teeth of a gale, sitting up all night because one of the men had a fever. They returned to Britain to find a war had started overseas, and that ordinary life had little place for tales of survival. Shackleton would try again to return to the ice in later years, and would die without finishing some of the projects he wanted. Yet the story that lingers is not the unfinished business of ambition, but the ledger of lives saved. In the end, the lesson he taught was quiet and exacting. Great leadership is less about the plan you name and more about the lives you refuse to abandon when the plan dies. They had set out to conquer a continent, and had instead learned how to preserve one another. On a windswept shore of rock and guano, among tents and a patched lifeboat, the Endurance expedition proved that tenacity backed by tenderness could carve order from a bleak and indifferent world. The ship was gone, but the measure of the voyage was not timber and sail. It was the look on a man's face when he stepped ashore from a rescue boat and saw his comrades alive. That look, equal parts relief and disbelief, is the lasting image of a leader who held his men together long enough for the sea to let them go home.